Something appeared where the old story seemed closed. Why did Project COLDFEET, the CIA raid on a Soviet ice station, change what people thought was buried there? A B-17 circles a broken Soviet ice station. The year is 1962. Below the aircraft, somewhere on the Arctic pack, two men are waiting to be pulled off the ice. Not landed for, pulled off into the sky by a system that has never been used this way on a real operation before. They have spent 7 days alone on abandoned Soviet ground, and what they carried back would stay largely out of public view for decades. Hold that image. The circling aircraft, the two figures on the ice. We will come back to how they got up into that plane. First, you need to understand the ground they were standing on, because it was not solid ground at all. It was a floe, a slab of drifting Arctic sea ice moving with the currents, carrying a research camp built by the Soviet Union. For most of the 20th century, the Soviets ran a long program of these floating stations. They called them drifting stations. Crews would occupy a piece of ice, build huts and instruments on it, and let the current carry them across the top of the world. The Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution counts 88 Soviet polar crews occupying drift station floes between 1937 and 1991. 88. Half a century of men living on moving ice, measuring the water, measuring the depth, measuring the sound. And that last word, sound, is the reason this story exists. Because the Arctic Ocean is not empty water. It is capped by ice. And beneath that ice in the Cold War, both sides understood a submarine could hide. A submarine under the ice cannot easily be seen from above. It moves in a world of noise and cold and pressure. Whoever learned to hear those submarines, to detect them under the ice, would hold an advantage no map could show. That is the quiet center of this whole file. Not territory, not a border. The ability to listen under the ice. Now, in the early 1960s, the United States had its own drift stations, its own men on its own floes, doing its own measurements, and it watched the Soviet ones. Aircraft flew the Arctic. They photographed. They noted where the Soviet camps were and where they drifted. Then something changed the picture. U.S. aircraft observed a Soviet drifting station that had been abandoned. The crew was gone. The huts were still there. The instruments were still there. Left behind on the ice. Think about what that means to an intelligence officer. An empty enemy laboratory floating in international waters unguarded. Everything the Soviets had installed to study the Arctic, still sitting out there, waiting. That was the opportunity. Reach it. Get inside it. See what they had been measuring. The first target had a name. NP-9, North Pole 9, one of the numbered Soviet drifting stations. It had been abandoned, and for a moment it looked reachable. But this is the Arctic. Nothing holds still. The ice that carried NP-9 kept moving while the plan was still being written. By the time the operation could be considered and approved, NP-9 had drifted out of reach. The prize floated away before anyone could touch it. That is the first hard lesson of this file. The target is not fixed. The ground itself is in motion, and every day of hesitation moves it farther. So the opportunity should have closed. The story should have ended there. An empty station, seen, wanted, lost. Except a second station came open. NP-8, North Pole 8. It too was abandoned, and this one sat where it could be reached. Reachable from Canadian airfields. That distinction, reachable, is everything. Because there was no plan to land on the ice and stay. There was no runway. There was no safe way to bring a heavy aircraft down on an abandoned Soviet floe and take off again with men and cargo aboard. The whole problem of COLDFEET was this. How do you put men onto a piece of drifting ice and then get them back without ever landing the aircraft? Hold that question. It is the engineering heart of the entire mission, and we will answer it. First, understand who was doing this, because Project COLDFEET was not one agency acting alone. It pulled together the Central Intelligence Agency, the Office of Naval Research, the United States Air Force, intelligence support tied to the Defense Intelligence Agency, and a company called Intermountain Aviation. That last name matters. Intermountain Aviation was a proprietary, a private aviation company that was, in truth, a front for the CIA. An airline you could hire that answered quietly to Langley. So the operation had the reach of the Navy, the lift of the Air Force, the analysts of the intelligence world, and a deniable aircraft to fly it. That is a lot of machinery aimed at one abandoned camp on the ice, which tells you how badly they wanted what was inside. Now the two men. Everything came down to two men on the ground. The first was Major James Smith of the United States Air Force, an experienced paratrooper, and a Russian linguist. Read that pairing again. A man trained to jump out of aircraft and trained to read the language of the enemy who built the camp. You do not send that man to guess. You send him to jump onto a Soviet station and read what he finds. The labels, the notebooks, the instruments, in the language they were written in. The second man was Lieutenant Leonard LeSchack of the United States Naval Reserve, a geophysicist, and crucially, a man who had worked with an acoustic surveillance system on a U.S. drift station. Acoustic, there is that word again. Sound under the ice. LeSchack already understood what an under-ice listening system looked like, because he had helped run one on the American side. So put the two together. One man who could read Soviet science in Russian. One man who could recognize Soviet acoustic gear on sight because he had used the American version. Between them, they could walk into an abandoned enemy laboratory and know in real time what was worth carrying home. That is a very deliberate pairing. It tells you the mission planners already suspected what NP-8 held. They did not send two random volunteers. They sent a linguist and an acoustics man to an ice station in the Arctic, where the great secret was listening for submarines under the ice. The dates are precise. On the 28th of May, 1962, a modified CIA B-17 located NP-8, not a bomber on a bombing run, a converted aircraft flying reconnaissance and delivery over the pack. It found the abandoned station, and it dropped Smith and LeSchack by parachute onto the ice. Two men falling out of a B-17 onto a Soviet floe that no one was guarding and no one was maintaining. The moment their canopies opened, the loop we opened at the start began to close in. They were down. They were on the ice, and the aircraft could not land to get them back. So how does this end with two men rising into the sky? The answer is a piece of equipment fitted to that B-17. The Fulton Surface-to-Air Recovery System, also known as Skyhook. It was built to do the impossible thing this mission required. Retrieve a person or cargo from the ground without the aircraft ever touching down. A man on the ice would be connected to a line. A balloon would carry that line up into the air. The aircraft would fly in low, catch the line, and lift him off the surface into the sky, then reel him aboard. No runway, no landing, just a plane, a line, and a man snatched off the ice. The system came from Robert Fulton. He developed Skyhook after earlier fixed-wing pickup concepts, earlier attempts to grab things from the ground with an aircraft in motion. Fulton refined it into something that could lift a human being safely, and the CIA later used it operationally. In COLDFEET. Here is a detail the agency itself notes, and it is worth sitting with. Skyhook later became familiar to the public through Hollywood. You have probably seen a version of it on a screen without knowing its name. A hero clipped to a line, yanked into the sky by a passing plane. Movie invention, it seems. But Project COLDFEET was the real thing. A real operational use on the Arctic ice in 1962. The screen version came later. The ice came first. So place it all together now. The B-17 has dropped its 2 men, Smith, the paratrooper and Russian reader, LeSchack, the geophysicist who knows the sound of under-ice listening. They are alone on an abandoned Soviet station that is slowly drifting on the Arctic Ocean. The nearest friendly ground is a Canadian airfield, far behind them. The only way home is a hook and a line, catching a balloon out of the sky, and the clock has started. Because the ice does not wait, and neither does the weather, and neither does the fuel in that aircraft. They would spend 7 days on that station. 7 days on abandoned Soviet ground, going through what the crew left behind. We open this file with the B-17 circling, hunting for 2 men waiting on the pack. Now you know why they were there. You know who they were, and what they were trained to find. And you know the one thing still hanging over the whole operation. What did they actually find inside that Soviet station? And how much of it has ever been allowed into the open? That is where this goes next. 7 days. Hold on to that number, because it is longer than it sounds. 7 days is not a raid. A raid is minutes. You drop in, you grab, you leave. 7 days is an occupation. It means the 2 men had to live on that floe, sleep on it, work on it, trust ice that the Soviets themselves had already walked away from. Remember why NP-8 was abandoned in the first place. Crews leave a drifting station when the ice begins to fail. When it cracks, when it thins, when it starts to break apart under the camp. The Soviets did not evacuate for no reason. They left because the floe was no longer safe to stand on. And that is the ground the CIA chose to put 2 men on for a week. So picture the working conditions. Smith and LeSchack moving between abandoned huts. Instruments still in place. Papers, notebooks, equipment, left where the crew dropped them when they pulled out. An entire scientific station, frozen in the middle of its own work, waiting. For a linguist and a geophysicist, this was the target come to life. Smith could read the Russian on the labels and in the records. He could tell the difference between routine weather logging and something else. LeSchack could look at the hardware and know what it was for. He had run the American version of exactly this kind of work. So they were not guessing at random piles of gear. They were reading a laboratory. And what that laboratory had been studying is the payoff this whole file has been building toward. The intelligence they collected included evidence of Soviet research on acoustic detection of under-ice submarines. There it is, the word that has run under every part of this story. Acoustic. The Soviets, on that floe, had been working on how to hear submarines beneath the ice. And more than that, evidence of Arctic anti-submarine warfare techniques. Not just listening, hunting. The methods for finding and tracking a submarine in the one place a submarine was supposed to be invisible. Understand what that meant in 1962. The Arctic ice cap was becoming a hiding place for the newest weapons of the Cold War. Submarines that could slip under the ice, out of sight, and stay there. For the United States, the under-ice ocean was a shield. If the Soviets had learned to see through that shield, to detect and track boats under the pack, then the shield was thinner than anyone in Washington had assumed. That is why they sent a Russian reader and an acoustics man. That is why they pulled together the agency, the Navy, the Air Force, the analysts, and a deniable airline. Not for weather data. For the answer to a single question. How well can the Soviets hear us under the ice? And on NP-8, abandoned and drifting, the beginning of that answer was sitting in the huts. But collecting it was only half the problem. Now they had to leave, and leaving was the part no one had ever done this way before. 7 days in, the aircraft came back. The same converted B-17 flying low over the pack, looking for the men it had dropped. And here the plan showed its strange, careful logic. Because the extraction was not one pickup, it was three separate passes, 3 separate catches of the line out of the Arctic sky. And the order tells you everything about what mattered most. The first pickup was not a man. It was the intelligence material, the collected records, whatever Smith and LeSchack had judged worth carrying home. That went up first, before either man left the ice. Read that decision carefully. If something went wrong, if the weather closed in, if the aircraft could make only one more pass, the planners had already decided what the mission was for. Not the men, the material. The evidence of Soviet under-ice listening went up on the line before a single human being. That is how badly they wanted it. The men would follow. Second up was LeSchack, the geophysicist, the acoustics man. The CIA's own descriptions, preserved in its art and museum records, portray the moment plainly. The B-17 flying in, the line rising on its balloon, the aircraft catching LeSchack and lifting him off the ice into the sky. Snatched from the abandoned Soviet floe into the air, reeled aboard a moving plane, which left one man still on the ground, Smith, the paratrooper, the Russian linguist. Alone now, on a drifting station the Soviets had given up on, waiting for the last pass. And here is the image the agency itself keeps. Smith at the NP-8 pickup point, the spot marked by red smoke. A single column of red rising off the white Arctic ice so the aircraft could find him. One man, red smoke. An empty enemy station drifting beneath his feet, and somewhere out over the pack, a converted bomber turning in for the final catch. Everything about the mission had narrowed to this. The material was gone. LeSchack was gone. Only Smith remained, standing by the smoke, connected to a line and a balloon, waiting to be pulled into the sky the same way. The last pass, the last catch, and then the ice was empty again. Both men off. The intelligence off. Nothing left on NP-8 but the abandoned huts the Soviets had already walked away from, drifting on toward wherever the current would take them. That is the operation. A B-17 that never landed. 2 men who spent a week on enemy ground that was falling apart beneath them. A hook and a line and a balloon catching human beings out of the Arctic sky. And a laboratory's worth of evidence about how the Soviets were learning to hear submarines under the ice. It worked, which is why the agency now displays it, tells it, keeps its images. But look at what we actually have. We have the shape of the mission, the dates, the names, the 3 pickups in order, the red smoke, and the man beside it. What we do not fully have is the content, the intelligence itself. We are told what it concerned: acoustic detection of under-ice submarines, Arctic anti-submarine warfare techniques. We are not told, in the open, how much of it there was, or how good it was, or what precisely it revealed. And that is where the file starts to close again, even as it opens, because the story of the raid is now public. The story of what the raid found is mostly still summary, still surface, still the outline of a secret rather than the secret itself. Which leaves the questions we will have to sit with. How much of that recovered Soviet acoustic intelligence remains unavailable in the open record, described only in summary? How much did 7 days on NP-8 actually change what the United States understood about Soviet ears under the ice? And how much of the mission we think we know survives through official history? And how much depends on the retellings that came after? That is what we turn to now. Start with the first of those questions, because it is the one the record answers least. How much of the recovered intelligence remains out of public view? We are told the subject: acoustic detection of under-ice submarines, Arctic anti-submarine warfare techniques. Those are categories. They are not contents. Notice what the open record gives us and what it withholds. It gives us the shape of the box. It does not open the box. We know Smith and LeSchack carried material off that floe. We know the material went up first, ahead of the men, because it mattered more than the men. But the substance of it, the measurements, the methods, the specific Soviet findings, remains in public, a summary of a summary. That is not an accident of a lost file. That is the ordinary shape of intelligence that stayed useful. Because here is the logic of the Cold War. If COLDFEET revealed how well the Soviets could hear American submarines under the ice, then the value of that knowledge lay in the Soviets not knowing you had it. You do not publish the answer to a question your enemy is still asking. You act on it quietly. You adjust. You change how your own boats move under the pack, and you say nothing. So the very success of the mission is a reason the details stayed dark. The more useful the intelligence, the longer the silence around it. That brings us to the second question. How much did 7 days on NP-8 actually change what the United States understood? And here we have to be honest about the limits of what we can say. The claim we can stand on is narrow and firm. The team recovered evidence of Soviet research into hearing submarines under the ice and into hunting them there. That is documented. What is not laid out in the open is the size of the shift it produced. Whether it confirmed what analysts already feared, whether it surprised them, whether it forced a change in how the American under-ice fleet operated. We can reason about why it mattered. The Arctic ice cap was becoming a hiding place for the newest submarines of the era, boats that could slip beneath the pack and disappear. For the United States, that ice was a shield. If the Soviets were learning to see through it, the shield was thinner than assumed. That is the stake. But the measure of the outcome, how much thinner and what Washington did about it, is not something the open file hands us. We are left with the fact of the collection and the shadow of its consequences, which is a strange place to stand. We know the mission worked. We know what it was for. We do not fully know what it changed. And that leads to the third question, the quietest one, and in some ways, the most unsettling. How much of the story we have just told survives through official history, and how much rests on the retellings that came later? Consider how we know COLDFEET at all. The agency itself now tells this story. It keeps the images, it preserves the description in its art and museum records. The B-17 catching LeSchack. Smith at the pickup point, marked by red smoke. Those are the pictures the institution chose to keep. And there is a lesson buried in that choice. An organization built to keep secrets is also, in the end, the narrator of this one. The dates we trust. The 28th of May, 1962. The 7 days, the 3 pickups in that order. Material, then LeSchack, then Smith. Those come to us through the official account. They are the load-bearing facts. But the texture, the sense of what it felt like on that failing floe, the small human details of a week on abandoned ice, that lives in the retellings. In the versions told afterward, expanded, dramatized, smoothed, and it is worth keeping the two apart. The documented frame, and the story that grew around the frame. Because the same instinct that snatched 2 men off the ice with a hook and a line is a cinematic instinct. Skyhook itself proves the point. The agency notes that the recovery system later became familiar through Hollywood. A hero clipped to a line, yanked into the sky by a passing plane. Most people who have seen that image believe it is invention, a screenwriter's flourish. But it was real first. It was used on the Arctic ice in 1962 on this operation. The screen borrowed from the file, not the other way around. And that inversion is the strange heart of Project COLDFEET. It is a true story that looks like a fiction, a converted bomber that never lands. 2 men dropped onto an enemy laboratory that is drifting and breaking apart. A week alone on ice, the Soviets themselves fled. A column of red smoke on the white pack, a hook out of the sky. Every part of it sounds invented. Every part of it is documented. And that may be why it was allowed into the open at all. The spectacle of the recovery could be told. The parachutes, the balloon, the catch. Those make a story an institution is willing to show. The contents of the huts are another matter. So we are left with a mission whose method is now public and whose product is still, in large part, private. We can watch the B-17 turn in for the catch. We cannot read what Smith and LeSchack carried up that line. Set it against the scale of what was happening up there. 88 Soviet polar crews on drifting ice between 1937 and 1991. Half a century of men living on moving floes, measuring the water, the depth, and the sound. NP-8 was one abandoned camp inside that long program. One floe reached for 7 days out of decades of Soviet presence on the ice. And even that single week produced enough that the agency judged the material worth lifting off first, ahead of the men who gathered it. Which forces the last uncomfortable thought. If one abandoned station yielded that much, what was on the ones that drifted away? NP-9, the first target, floated out of reach before anyone could touch it. The prize that got away. We will never know what was in its huts, because the ice carried it off before the plan could close. And the other camps, the occupied ones, the ones never reached, never entered, never read by a Russian linguist standing in the cold. Those remain, by definition, outside the record entirely. So the file closes the way it opened, on motion, on ice that will not hold still. We have the raid, we have the names, the dates, the red smoke, the 3 catches out of the Arctic sky. We have the fact that the Soviets were learning to hear submarines under the ice, and that the United States went and took the proof. What we do not have still is the full measure of it. How much of that recovered acoustic intelligence has ever left the summary and entered the open record? How much the 7 days on NP-8 truly changed what Washington understood about Soviet ears beneath the pack. And how much of the story itself is documented fact, and how much is the shape the retellings gave it afterward. The B-17 flew home. The flow drifted on, empty. And the answer to what mattered most, what the Soviets could hear, and how much of it the United States carried away, is still in the part that counts, out on the ice where we cannot follow.